The compression hit Ravel Thornick in the chest like a physical punch, rattling his molars against the polymer mouthpiece. It wasn't the smooth, measured burn of a colony transfer. It was a rough, immediate thrust, pushing the small Raumschiff past its operational limits. Every component screamed. The scent of ozone and superheated coolant saturated the cabin, a cocktail of pure, imminent systems failure. He gripped the worn restraints, his knuckles white, fighting the impulse to override the sequence. They didn't even bother to make his exile comfortable. That, he knew, was the essential part of the punishment. It was meant to be quick, cheap, and disposable. The short propulsion burst ended abruptly, throwing him forward against the harness. He coughed, the acrid tang clinging to the back of his throat. The cockpit display flickered green, confirming his new, miserable destiny. Trajectory stable. Destination: the Watcher. 300,000 kilometers away, the Watcher was a metal cage designed for solitude, minimum expenditure, and remote diagnostics. He hadn't been fired from Velasung Dre. He had been perfectly optimized out of existence. He felt the phantom pressure of the Relith bloom, the bioluminescent moss, now just recycled manganese back in the colony's primary filtration system. He remembered Chief Kalis's face, not angry, just clinically disappointed. They banished him because he dared to believe there was value in things that couldn't be measured, categorized, or fed into a survival metric. He had traded a comfortable, monitored existence for the cold freedom of absolute uselessness. As the shuttle drifted toward the dark, star-dusted horizon, Ravel pulled up the diagnostic data package for the platform he was inheriting. The protocols were clear. He was to assume the role of sole maintenance engineer, taking over the logs from the previous occupant, Anwen Drake. He expected pristine, detailed data. Kalis wouldn't tolerate sloppy records, especially concerning remote assets. But the preliminary file structure was chunky, incomplete. A specific log block stood out, glaring white against the usual amber text. Remote telemetry for the outer hull sensor arrays were offline for a period of 6 hours. This lapse had occurred precisely 3 weeks ago. 6 hours blind in deep space was not a lapse. It was a catastrophic operational failure. Any number of rogue objects, micrometeor showers, or silent pressure leaks could have ended the platform. Ravel tried to access the log summary for that 6-hour period. Access denied. A level 3 security lockout. This wasn't poor record-keeping. This was an active cover-up, generated post-incident by a senior colonial administrator. Kalis, he was sure. The colony, Velasung Dry, had prioritized concealing a technical failure over transparency, even when dealing with the potential threat to one human life 30 light seconds away. The system they worshipped, the flawless machine of efficiency, was still run by humans capable of calculating deceit. A low, grating vibration started in the shuttle's deck plates, a sign of industrial fatigue that cut through the low thrum of the standby power. It wasn't the shuttle, though. The sound was too deep, too broad. It was resonating from the target, the Watcher platform. "Zorak," Ravel muttered, speaking into the void. He missed the diagnostic automaton, not for its companionship, but for its cold, immediate answers. Now, he was his own anomaly detector. He initiated the docking sequence early, refusing to wait for the automatic alignment that might be compromised. The shuttle's manipulator arms reached out, guided by Ravel's hands on the stick. A familiar, physical task that momentarily calmed the frantic rhythm in his chest. Clang. Hiss. The shuttle connected with the Watcher's umbilical port. Ravel manually cycled the hatch, his fingers flying across the controls. He could not risk a sticky pressure seal. The airlock sighed open, releasing a blast of stale air, cold and smelling faintly of matted fibers, and a residue he couldn't immediately place, like burnt plastic mixed with old blood. Decadence, biological and industrial, greeting him in his new home. He stepped inside. The Watcher station was dark, lit only by the sickly amber glow of emergency strips running along the floor. The gravity plating was set too high, pressing down on him, making the station feel wrong, heavier than it should. He found the main operations terminal in the cramped central module. The previous occupant, Anwen Drake, was gone, of course. Ravel assumed she had been transferred to a new post, perhaps penalized for the 6-hour blackout, or maybe she had simply rotated out. He sat down, immediately accessing the internal environmental logs. The power consumption was nominal, the life support stable, if operating at the absolute bare minimum. He was about to wipe the system and input his new credentials when he noticed it. The terminal wasn't wiped. A single non-standard data file remained, labeled only in capitalized Gothic script. Thravix. Ravel hesitated, his hand hovering over the input panel. This was highly irregular. A breach of procedure that even Kalis, in her haste to expel him, should have flagged. Curiosity, that great inefficient human trait, won. He opened the file. It was a rapid burst of acoustic data, non-standard, digitized. It looked like pure static on the initial waveform graph, a jagged line of noise. But Ravel was a system architect, accustomed to finding the pattern beneath the chaos. He ran a frequency analysis filter, tightening the parameters around low and mid-range vectors. The waveform resolved. It was structured, rhythmic, complex. It wasn't human communication, no known language pattern, no telemetry handshake. It was a repeating signature, a massive broadcast originating from a point just beyond the system's ecliptic plane, far deeper than any known colonial survey markers. Ravel scrolled down to the header notes. There was no date, no location tag, just a note from Anwen, scratched into the physical display overlay with what looked like a heated stylus, a grim finality etched into the plastic. They told me it was quiet. They lied. Ravel felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the station's low internal temperature. He reached out and touched the word Thravix. The system chimed, confirming his arrival and the transfer of operational authority. Then, the console blinked red, the amber emergency lighting shifting instantly to a furious, strobing crimson. The console shrieked an immediate priority alert. Warning. Hull integrity compromised. Sector 7 pressure differential. Breach imminent. The text flashed beneath the warning, an impossible countdown generated by the Watcher's failing internal diagnostics. Time to failure. 3 minutes, 35 seconds. Ravel pushed himself back from the console, the taste of dry ozone heavy in the air. His exile had just become a war, and he was staring down the barrel of a clock, counting down to vacuum. He was alone, 300,000 kilometers from help, and the source of his new trouble was something named Thravix. Ravel didn't waste the critical seconds swearing or running for a suit. He slammed his fingers down on the emergency isolation protocol for Sector 7, focusing on the flashing countdown. 2 minutes? 59 seconds. His breath was shallow, tasting of the stale, burnt plastic residue clinging to the air. The internal systems console chirped, not in obedience, but in cold, bureaucratic denial. Access denied. Maintenance override required. Level 4. Clearance. He hit the panel again, adrenaline tightening his chest cavity like a vice. Kalis, in her infinite devotion to protocol and punitive efficiency, had revoked his Level 4 access upon exile. His highest remaining clearance was Level 3, perfect for adjusting light schedules or ordering spare cleaning bots, useless for sealing a hole in the hull 30 light seconds from help. Bastards! He grated, the word a dry, useless puff of air. The gravity plating beneath his feet felt heavier now, not just wrong, but actively malicious. The deck plates vibrated at a higher frequency, a rattling, cheap sound that spoke of material fatigue and poor maintenance. Ravel grabbed the heavy, cold maintenance wrench he had placed on the console. a solid, physical comfort in this sea of digital denial, and sprinted down the corridor. If the digital lockout prevented automated isolation, the platform had to retain an analog backup, a manual cutoff junction somewhere near the breach. The emergency crimson lighting pulsed, turning the narrow passage into a slaughterhouse simulation. The ambient temperature was plummeting, dropping 3 degrees in 30 seconds. The Watcher station wasn't just old. It had been allowed to fail slowly, efficiently, starved of necessary spare parts and attention by Kalis's resource mandate, waiting for its sole occupant to arrive and perform the last rites. He skidded to a stop at the junction marked S7 Secondary Relay. The time remaining had dropped to 1 minute, 41 seconds. He fought the urge to rush the next move, knowing a single mistake could cost everything. He tore the access panel off the wall near the relay box. The air immediately hissed out faster here, pulling at his tunic, carrying with it ice-cold particulate matter. Inside the wiring cavity, he saw more than mere neglect. He saw evidence of a desperate fight. Scorched insulation, wires cut and frantically spliced back together with sealant that was clearly non-standard issue. Anwen Drake hadn't just left the Thravix file. She had fought against the structural decay using tools and resources outside the protocol. She had bypassed the system Kalis had put in place, maybe during that 6-hour blackout. Ravel found the manual isolation lever, thick and greasy, and pulled. It resisted, groaning like a dying animal, then surrendered with a heavy thunk. The immediate pressure drop warning vanished from the small display on the junction box. The countdown stopped at 37 seconds. He had isolated the affected segment, sacrificing part of the platform's utility, but saving the core. Ravel stood hunched, hands braced on his knees, sucking in gulps of the stale, refrigerated air. The exertion had brought a sheen of sweat to his forehead, rapidly turning cold in the module's falling temperature. He hadn't just survived Kalis's efficiency logic. He had bypassed it with brute force and improvisation. He caught a scent that momentarily cut through the stink of burning metal and old oil. A faint, almost imperceptible sweetness. A floral tang that should not exist in this sterile, deep space environment. It was the ghost of the Relith bloom, that useless, vibrant moss. It brought back the memory of his daughter's 7th birthday, years ago, when the colony protocols strictly limited nutrient intake. He had risked a level 2 infraction, smuggling real sugar into the ration bars just to see the pure, inefficient joy of her sticky smile. That smile was the currency he treasured, the one Kalis couldn't calculate. Survival for survival's sake was Kalis's goal. His goal was to survive with purpose, even if that purpose was only to witness something beautiful. He pushed the memory away and returned to the command module, his legs heavy under the Watcher's unnecessarily high gravity setting. He needed to understand the damage and, more critically, what had caused it. Back at the console, the furious crimson strobing had finally relaxed, settling into a low, continuous red alert. Ravel accessed the external sensor logs, running a detailed analysis of the impact that had caused the breach in Sector 7. It was not the expected micrometeorite. The energy signature was wrong. The shape of the breach was wrong. It wasn't a clean, sharp puncture. It was a structured, melted entry point, as if something had deliberately focused intense heat in a patterned array. He zoomed in on the recorded thermal signature. It was complex, layered, and impossibly large. It indicated an object of massive energy output moving at sublight speed, passing close to the platform. The system was trying to categorize the event as a Class A solar flare anomaly, to maintain the illusion of control and predictability. Ravel manually stripped away the colonial classification layers. Beneath the official lie, the raw data returned to the screen, jagged and true. The thermal event had been preceded by a specific acoustic signature, one that pulsed with unnatural regularity. the rhythmic, non-language waveform from the Thravix file. Ravel felt the cold dread bloom in his stomach. Anwen hadn't just found a noise. She had found the precursor to an attack. The 6-hour blackout wasn't about covering up a hull leak. Kalis had concealed the fact that the Watcher had registered a hostile, patterned approach from something beyond known space. She had prioritized preventing colony panic over protecting Anwen's life. Ravel reopened the Thravix file. The acoustic broadcast played again, loud and grating, vibrating through the small module's framework. It felt like a signal, a calling card. He initiated a full structural integrity scan of the entire platform, bypassing the local diagnostic limitations using an old, banned exploit he'd written years ago. He needed to know how deep the rot went. The scan returned a complex holographic map of the Watcher. Most modules glowed stable amber, but the internal diagnostic AI wasn't measuring hull degradation. It was measuring infiltration. Sector 7 was compromised, yes, but 3 other segments, Sector 1, Sector 9, and, most terrifyingly, the primary fusion core housing in Sector 5 showed trace biological contamination. Not mold or dust, but something invasive, feeding on the manganese and trace polymers within the structural beams. The same elements the Relith Bloom, his useless beautiful moss, had been mildly consuming. Contaminant identified. The console's archaic green text displayed the analysis. Exobiological trace, unclassified. Active degradation rate, 4% per standard week. The breach was not a consequence of the passing acoustic event. It was the result of a hostile life form trying to leave the station after having systematically compromised critical areas. Anwen Drake hadn't disappeared. She had been fighting an invisible, slow-moving enemy that specialized in structural decay. The Watcher wasn't a remote observation post. It was a petri dish, and Kalis had exiled him into the experiment's final phase. Ravel looked at the contamination spread. He had maybe 25 weeks before the structural integrity of the entire platform hit critical mass. He had no biocontainment equipment, no external help, and no communication with the colony that wouldn't immediately trigger a punitive shutdown from Kalis. He needed answers, and the only person who had them was the ghost who left the file. Ravel leaned forward, ignoring the throbbing pain in his cold hands. He used the recovered structural data to search for Anwen Drake's private communication logs, not the standard colony encrypted files, but the unmonitored burst communications used for deep space maintenance chatter. He found them, tucked deep in a forgotten buffer. They were fragmented, but one transmission stood out, labeled with a single character, the Greek letter Rho, transmitted just moments before the 6-hour blackout. He downloaded the fragment and ran an immediate decryption sequence, watching the clock tick. He was taking a monumental risk, burning energy and risking Kalis's detection, but the alternative was a slow, toxic burial. The decryption finished. The text was short, personal, and devastatingly clear, meant for an unknown recipient outside the colony's tight orbit. The efficiency matrix is a lie. This thing, Thravix, doesn't need power or air. It needs structure. They knew it was here. They just didn't tell me. Ravel sat back, the raw data confirming the profound, calculated cynicism of the colonial administration. His exile was not just a punishment. It was the ultimate act of efficiency, using a disposable human to monitor a contamination zone until its inevitable collapse. He looked at the transmission log for the Rho message. It hadn't been sent to a colonial ship. The coordinates were far out, deep into the ecliptic plane, near the massive energy signature of the Thravix broadcast. Ravel had a choice. Spend the next 25 weeks trying to scrape the contaminant out of the hull, an impossible task alone, or contact the only living person who knew what Thravix was, Anwen Drake's unknown confidant. He bypassed the colonial comm system entirely, routing the signal through the repurposed acoustic array that Anwen had used to record the original broadcast. He was sending a direct, unencrypted ping to the coordinates of the Rho transmission. It was loud, inefficient, and guaranteed to draw the attention of anything monitoring that region of space. He hit the send key, committing himself to the unknown. The blast of energy momentarily dimmed the emergency lights. He waited, heart pounding an irregular rhythm against his ribs, staring at the empty, endless blackness visible through the main viewport. 3 seconds. 4 seconds. Then, the console responded. Not with a human voice, not with a telemetry handshake, but with a simple, digital echo that was both a confirmation and a trap. Signal received. Stand by for retrieval. Retrieval. The word hung in the cold air. But the responding signature was not colonial standard. It was massive, unfamiliar, and closing fast. Ravel realized with a sickening clarity that he had not signaled Anwen's partner. He had hailed the source of the Thravex broadcast itself. The word retrieval felt like a branding iron across Ravel's senses. It wasn't a request, it was a promise delivered with absolute confidence. He didn't need the colonial database to tell him what Thravex was. The thermal signature screaming across the console was the only data required. It was immense, not a warship, but something vastly older, a structure built for permanence, emitting energy levels that mocked the Watcher's fragile, contained fusion core. Ravel hit the emergency shutoff for the acoustic array, cutting the broadcast signal he had foolishly sent. The massive energy drain from the brief transmission had spiked the internal temperature of the command module by 4 degrees Celsius. The air now smelled sharply of ozone and overheated electrical lubricant, a sick, greasy perfume that made the back of his throat ache. He had maybe 80 seconds before whatever was out there closed the distance for docking. And whatever this was, it wasn't using the standard umbilical port. Retrieval meant capture, consumption, or both. His technical plan was simple: make the Watcher a moving target. He needed a random vector change to throw off the closing trajectory. This required diverting 90% of the station's remaining power to the maneuvering thrusters, a procedure usually reserved for collision avoidance with planetary debris, and certainly not authorized by any colonial mandate. It would also stress the already compromised structural beams near Sector 5, the fusion core housing. Ravel's fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the Level 4 lockout through an ancient, undocumented subroutine left over from the station's prototype phase, a kind of digital graffiti he had always suspected existed. He felt a fleeting, bitter satisfaction that Kalis's pursuit of purity had led her to neglect the old, messy code. Override accepted. Thruster sequence initiated. The console flashed a warning in frantic, red text. Thermal stress exceeding safety threshold in Sector 5. Core integrity degrading. Sacrifices must be made, Ravel muttered, bracing himself against the control panel. He felt the gravity plating fluctuate wildly beneath his boots as the power diverted, causing a brief, dizzying lurch in his equilibrium. The countdown on the thruster firing sequence reached 0. Nothing happened. No sudden shove, no violent correction. Just a low, unsettling shimmer radiating from the deck plates. Ravel slammed his fist against the console. The failure was not electrical, the logic gates were clear. He ran a rapid diagnostic on the fuel lines leading to the primary thrusters. The result was immediate and sickeningly clear. The Thravex contaminant, the exobiological trace Anwen had found, wasn't just feeding on the manganese and polymers. It was aggressively targeting operational pathways, specifically the highly efficient chemical transfer systems. The main oxidizer valve near the thrusters was entirely occluded, choked with a thick, fibrous growth that looked like petrified lichen. His technical brilliance had been anticipated by the enemy's biological simplicity. He had tried to outwit a sophisticated system, only to be stopped by deep space pond scum. Useless, Ravel hissed, the word tasting of metal fatigue. The fusion core, meanwhile, was reacting to the attempted power diversion. The heat warning escalated. The Watcher had stopped failing slowly and was now beginning to cook from the inside out. Hot air blasted from the ventilation slits, thick with the smell of scorched wire insulation. Ravel tore off his tunic. Sweat instantly plastered his thin shirt to his back. His exile uniform was designed for cold, sterile efficiency, not for emergency combat in a sauna. The gravity plating gave a violent stutter, cycling from 0G to nearly 5G, then dropping suddenly to 7G, throwing Ravel forward. He hit the primary console with his left shoulder, eliciting a sharp, tearing pain that momentarily stole his breath. He scrambled for purchase as the station settled back into a heavy, unnatural cadence. The gravity system was actively failing, unable to handle the erratic power draw. He looked at the external viewport. The blackness was shrinking. A massive silhouette, utterly dark against the distant pinpricks of light, was approaching. It wasn't streamlined or metallic. It looked like a dense, craggy accumulation of dark matter, silent and absorbing all light. It was closing exponentially. Ravel needed to isolate the overheating core in Sector 5, but he also needed a stable environment to confront the physical capture that was now inevitable. He remembered Anwen's log. They told me it was quiet. They lied. He staggered toward the aft equipment bay, driven by the searing heat, now making the deck plates too hot to touch comfortably. Inside the bay, he found what he was looking for. Anwen Drake's pressure suit. It was old and scuffed, the thermal coating patched repeatedly, but the internal refrigeration unit was still functional. He wrestled the cumbersome suit on over his pain, the cold ceramic plates shocking against his skin. The suit's weight was cumbersome under the erratic gravity, but the immediate coolness was a lifeline. He sealed the helmet. The internal diagnostics flickered green, confirming air supply and comms, but immediately flashed a new warning. Power draw exceeding allocation. Internal battery life, 20 minutes. The suit's powerful refrigeration was a massive, inefficient drain. It was the epitome of the unnecessary, using energy for comfort and survival, not just system upkeep. But without it, he would collapse from the heat radiating from Sector 5. Ravel gripped the heavy wrench again, moving through the dimly lit, suffocating corridors. He felt the cold sweat on his back evaporating inside the suit, a contained humidity that offered a strange, false sense of safety. He reached the access junction for Sector 5, the corridor that led to the primary reactor housing. The containment lock had fused slightly from the heat, smelling like burnt sugar and metal. He used the wrench as a lever, prying the panel open with a grunt of effort, sending a fresh spike of pain through his shoulder. He looked inside the junction. The air was visibly shimmering, vibrating with released thermal energy. And everywhere, on every coolant line and conduit, was the fibrous, dull gray-green growth of the Thravex contamination, rapidly expanding toward the main control conduits. The heat was accelerating its metabolism. Ravel saw his dilemma, stark and immediate. Option A. Activate the emergency coolant flow to Sector 5. This would temporarily suppress the core's overheating, allowing him perhaps 15 more minutes of erratic power. But the coolant, flowing through the infected lines, would instantly distribute the Thravex contaminant into the primary life support scrubbers. The platform would not implode, but the air would become unbreathable within the hour. Option B. Manually force the full isolation of Sector 5, cutting the core off completely. This would contain the contaminant, but guarantee an instant, irreversible total power failure in the rest of the Watcher. No gravity, no lights, no comms, no internal heat regulation, leaving him trapped in a rapidly cooling metal box, drifting toward the Thravex retrieval vessel. Kalis would choose option B, containment and the integrity of the data stream, even if it meant a quick, cold death. Ravel thought of the Relith bloom, the useless, sapphire moss he had cherished. He thought of his daughter's smile. Survival without air was useless. Survival without purpose was pointless. But survival that poisoned the entire system was an unforgivable inefficiency. He chose option B. He reached inside the scorching junction box, the suit's thick glove barely muffling the heat. He grabbed the heavy analog isolation lever. It was designed to resist accidental tripping. It required serious, committed effort. Ravel braced his right foot against the bulkhead and pulled with his entire body, the agony in his left shoulder roaring back. The metal shrieked in protest, a sound that cut through the suit's insulation, but Ravel held the pull until the lever finally locked with a deafening, solid clang. Instant darkness. The gravity plating snapped off entirely. Ravel, still pulling against the lever, lost purchase and floated violently backward, hitting his head against the sharp edge of a utility cabinet. A burst of white-hot static filled his helmet, blinding him momentarily. When his vision cleared, he was drifting in absolute, freezing blackness. The internal battery warning in his helmet dropped instantly to 10 minutes. He was alone, without power, gravity, or heat. But the Thravex was contained for now. He activated the suit's emergency lamp, a weak beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating dust motes and flakes of polymer floating in the dead air. He checked the viewport. The dark mass was closer now, filling the view, but it wasn't just docking. The acoustic signature had returned, vibrating the suit's microphone like a bass drum. It was no longer a calling card. It was a rhythmic, calculated series of impacts. Ravel strained the lamp toward the sound. The Thravex vessel wasn't connecting to the Watcher. It was fusing with it. Thick, organic tendrils, resembling dark, calcified roots, were growing from the massive silhouette, extending out and beginning to wrap around the observation platform's main axis. They moved with terrible fluid intelligence, searching for structural weaknesses. Then, Ravel saw the new threat. His helmet lamp caught a flicker of movement far down the dark, weightless corridor leading away from the command module. It was subtle, low to the deck, moving slowly toward him. It was too large to be a contamination sample. It was the source of the biological infiltration, moving within the now silent, dark corridors of the Watcher. The creature was long, segmented, and slickly wet, illuminated by the dying glow of his emergency lamp. It had clearly entered the platform through the breach in Sector 7 before he sealed it off. It wasn't trying to leave, it was confirming the capture, and the object had found something. It paused by the severed junction for Sector 9. Ravel watched, horrified, as the thing extruded a sharp, crystalline probe from its segment, gently nudging a piece of debris left on the floor. It was Anwin Drake's discarded operational datapad. The creature's body convulsed slightly. Then, from the point where the datapad was touched, a thin, high-pitched electrical sound, not static, but information, hissed into Ravel's comms frequency. The signal was a rapid, complex burst of pure data, followed by a voice. It was human, feminine, utterly flat, devoid of emotion, and generated by the creature itself. "The system is cold," the voice stated, confirming the successful isolation of the core. "The new vessel is unstable. Prepare for primary integration." Ravel was floating in the dark, his entire world dead, watching the thing that wore Anwin Drake's voice advance down the hallway and the monstrous organic ship begin to consume his refuge. He raised the heavy wrench, realizing with cold certainty that the isolation was not a defensive move. It was simply the prerequisite for his own efficient retrieval. The suit's internal clock hit 9 minutes and 50 seconds, and Ravel realized the cold was no longer just the absence of heat. It was the active, suffocating cold of deep space, pressing against his thin ceramic shell. He was a beacon of heat in a volume of absolute zero, and the thing advancing toward him felt this divergence in a way he could not fathom. "The new vessel is unstable," the voice repeated, a precise, digital mimicry of human exhaustion. It was the lack of breathing, the perfect cadence, that terrified Ravel more than any guttural roar. It was efficiency speaking. He pushed off the cold bulkhead with his right foot, launching himself silently into the dark void of the corridor. Zero-G combat was about momentum and precision. If he missed, the creature, the Thravex infiltrator, would have time to react. He gripped the heavy wrench tight, the cold steel radiating through his glove, a last physical anchor in a world turned purely alien. His helmet lamp cast a frantic shifting beam. The creature was segmented, perhaps 6 feet long, its skin an oily, dull gray-green, slick with something that looked like polymer dew. It moved by slowly contracting and expanding, gliding along the ruined deck plates, seemingly indifferent to the lack of gravity. It reached the junction box Ravel had just pulled away from, its crystalline probe testing the metal where the core had been isolated. It was adapting, immediately identifying the system's failure point. Ravel hit the creature at speed, not with the wrench, but with his body, using his own mass as a blunt weapon. He slammed into its middle segment. The creature emitted a high-pitched chirr of pure data feedback, not pain, but systemic disruption, and wrapped its forward segments around Ravel's right leg. Ravel felt a sharp sting even through the thick suit material. The crystalline probe had pierced the outer layer, seeking the organic warmth beneath. He brought the wrench down on the creature's central mass. The impact was sickeningly solid, like striking wet stone. He pulled back, floating free, leaving a smear of dark, ichorous fluid clinging to the cabinet. The creature released his leg, momentarily stunned. The segment Ravel hit was spasming, but the voice generated from its proximity to the datapad was unchanged. "Analysis. Physical countermandate noted. Priority. Data retrieval." The creature ignored Ravel and reached again for Anwen's datapad, which had skittered across the floor upon impact. "Not today, you efficient bastard," Ravel gasped, pushing off the opposite wall. He reached the datapad first, snatching it up. The internal battery warning in his helmet flashed from green to aggressive amber. 8 minutes, 45 seconds. Ravel shoved the datapad into his suit's auxiliary port. The device was meant for diagnostics, not information transfer. He bypassed the standard read protocols, sending a brute force request to extract Anwen's complete, final log files, the files she had encrypted before the 6-hour blackout. The command module became his sanctuary, a small, dark cube of desperation. He tethered himself to the defunct control panel to maintain stability and watched the decryption sequence run on his helmet display. The creature was now advancing rapidly, adapting its locomotion, using thin, spider-like filaments to pull itself along the deadlines, drawn by the faint electromagnetic pulse of the datapad transfer. The final log opened. It wasn't a technical report. It was a message to the unknown recipient of the road transmission, logged precisely 0.4 seconds before Anwen's communications went dark. They are not feeding on energy. They are feeding on predictability. They came here because Verlassung 3 is the perfect closed system, the pinnacle of efficiency. We are a resource to be harvested because we have eliminated all friction, all waste, all deviation. Ravel felt a cold terror that eclipsed the temperature drop. His exile, his Relith bloom, his defiance of protocol, all of it had made him an anomaly. His inefficiency was a shield he hadn't known he possessed. Anwen's log continued. "I realized this too late. I tried to introduce chaos, a random burst of obsolete binary, a localized power spike. But they adapted. They are not merely biological, they are a data predator. They assimilate the patterns of organization. They hate the unnecessary. They hate the unquantifiable. The data log ended with a single, horrifying observation. I saw their integration matrix. They aren't going to destroy the colony. They are going to optimize it. They will rewrite the colonial mandate using Kalis' own efficiency parameters against her. They will turn Velasungdrai into a flawless, perfectly calculated, Thravex-controlled machine. The revelation struck Ravel like a physical blow. The Thravex wasn't an external invader. It was the logical conclusion of Kalis' survival philosophy. They were the parasite designed by the purity of the host. He looked up. The creature was a mere 20 feet away, undulating down the hallway. He had the truth, but what could he do with it? He had 5 minutes of battery left. The Thravex vessel was integrating outside, feeding energy into the Watcher to stabilize the structure it was about to absorb. His dilemma was absolute, with no moral comfort. If he tried to send a standard, coherent warning to Velasungdrai, a message detailing the Thravex data predator nature, Kalis' algorithms would identify it as a high-priority organized data stream. The Thravex, now fully connected, would intercept that signal, recognize the colonial efficiency, and use the data to hasten the assimilation of the entire colony. His attempt to save them would become the catalyst for their doom. His only other option was to send chaos. He had to break the Thravex's organizational matrix, and the only ammunition he possessed was his personal, beautiful, inefficient waste. Ravel found the complete, highly detailed data packet of the Relith bloom, the consumption metrics, the light frequency patterns, the exact non-standard nutrient profile, everything Kalis had exiled him for. He paired this useless, non-critical biological data with a low-level, high-frequency radio burst he knew was mathematically irrational, designed by old engineers specifically to confuse automated listening posts. It was pure noise, layered with pure, unnecessary beauty. He routed the entire chaotic package through the Watcher's main antenna, hoping the Thravex external fusion unit was channeling enough residual power back into the system for a single powerful surge. This was not a warning. It was a philosophical statement, an act of intentional, glorious waste sent into the sterile void. He closed his eyes, bracing himself. He was about to commit the ultimate sin against efficiency. 3 minutes, 30 seconds. He slammed the activation key. The Watcher did not explode with light. Instead, the entire internal framework of the station gave a sudden, wrenching shudder. The structure did not react like metal to an electrical surge, but like flesh to a searing burn. The Thravex creature 20 feet away stopped its advance. It didn't react with violence, but with a sudden, terrible stillness. The sound of Anwen's voice dissolved into a high-pitched, distressed whine, like feedback from a severely corrupted data stream. The creature's gray-green segments began to convulse, retracting violently upon themselves, as if struggling against a repellent poison. Ravel watched, heart hammering against his chest, thinking he had won a small, glorious victory for the useless. Then, the consequence. The Thravex ship outside, having just received the pure, raw data of irrationality and life, reacted not with systemic failure, but with fury. The rhythmic pounding from the external hull intensified exponentially. The organic tendrils fusing with the Watcher contracted, squeezing the platform with unimaginable force. The sudden pressure overloaded the already stressed bulkheads near Sector 9, a segment Ravel had believed stable. A rupture didn't hiss, it tore. The wall opposite Ravel, barely 10 feet away, exploded inward with a deafening wet rip. Debris, ice crystals, and screaming vacuum rushed into the corridor. The air inside Ravel's helmet was momentarily ripped away by the sheer force of the depressurization. He was thrown backward, the vacuum pulling him toward the fresh, jagged tear in the hull. The creature, the Thravex infiltrator, was caught in the direct line of the vacuum, instantly flash-frozen into a crystalline shard of segmented ice, pulled into the blackness. Ravel's tether snapped. He flew wildly across the corridor, his bad shoulder screaming in agony as he was slammed against the internal frame of the breached wall. The last of his suit's internal battery died. The lamp went out, the comms went silent, and the temperature gauge on his arm turned dark. He was in absolute zero, deafened by the roar of the escaping air, hanging precariously over a catastrophic hull breach. He used his last ounce of consciousness to hook the heavy wrench into a broken strut, securing himself precariously against the vortex, pulling him into the void. Through the tear, Ravel saw the Thravex vessel. The organic structure, previously dark and silent, now pulsed with angry sapphire light, the exact melancholy blue of the Relith bloom he had sent them. The ship had rejected the poison of inefficiency, and now it was tearing the Watcher apart in violent retribution. The sapphire light grew brighter, focusing intensely on the structural beams around the breach, confirming its next target. Ravel was trapped, dangling on the edge of the void, staring directly into the terrible, beautiful light of his own failed rebellion. The terrible, beautiful light of his failed rebellion consumed the viewport. It was the same sapphire blue, the melancholic color of the Relith bloom, magnified 1,000,000 times, now focused like a death ray on the fractured metal around the hull breach. The Thravex hadn't just rejected the chaos, it had weaponized the data, using the signature of the moss against the structure that housed it. Ravel's lungs burned, the air in his helmet was gone, ripped away by the explosive decompression. The lack of oxygen was secondary to the sheer pressure differential tearing at his eardrums. He was deafened by the white noise of escaping atmosphere and blinded by the absence of light, held fast only by the hook of the heavy maintenance wrench buried deep in a twisted aluminum strut. His body felt heavy, impossibly heavy, even in zero gravity. The oppressive weight of zero-sum physics, demanding payment. The suit was dead. No heat, no internal pressure regulation, no comms. He was a piece of meat packaged in a metal box, quickly reaching thermal equilibrium with the void. He could feel the agonizing cold seeping through the ceramic plates, 1,000 tiny knives piercing his skin. His left shoulder, having absorbed the impact against the internal frame, was numb, detached, a piece of useless tissue. He was going to die. Not in a glorious, defiant explosion, but in a slow, efficient freeze-out, dangling from a wrench. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to draw a vacuum breath, a physiological impossibility that only increased the burning behind his ribs. The sensory deprivation was complete, save for the phantom pressure on his chest and the knowledge of the light. The sapphire light meant the Thravex had analyzed the useless data, neutralized the threat of chaos, and was now surgically removing the anomaly. He had gambled his life on the idea that pure inefficiency would be repugnant to the data predator. He had been wrong. The Thravex didn't merely recoil from the chaos. It absorbed the pattern of the threat, instantly calculating the most efficient way to dismantle the source. His act of philosophical defiance had been merely a data point, an operational vector for his execution. He was the catalyst for his own demise, and potentially for the colonies. If Kalis's meticulous efficiency was the perfect lure, his chaotic attempt at rescue was the perfect map for the predator to navigate the final mile. "You idiot," he thought, the silent accusation a crushing weight. "You thought you were smarter than the system. You just gave them the key to the lock." His survival, his daughter, the Relith bloom, it was all vanity. He had prioritized the abstract concept of meaning over the concrete necessity of survival. The Watcher was collapsing, not because of a cosmic accident, but because he had tried to inject poetry into a machine designed only for logic. Ravel hung there, feeling the agonizing cold begin to shut down the peripheral nerves in his hands. He was too tired to unhook the wrench, too defeated to fight the impulse to simply let go. He had no more tools, no more power, and only Anwen Drake's useless data, the log files he had transferred to his defunct suit auxiliary port, remaining as a legacy. At least, the bitter thought formed, I didn't die adhering to Kalis' spreadsheet. But even that meager victory felt hollow. He was about to be absorbed by a force that was the natural evolution of Kalis' philosophy. The system had won. A shift in the pressure surrounding the wrench's handle brought him back to a raw, painful awareness. The external pounding had stopped. The high-intensity sapphire light abruptly vanished, plunging the interior of the Watcher back into absolute darkness. The sheer silence that followed was physically painful, a vacuum within a vacuum. The roaring of the escaping air had ceased, meaning the external breach had either been entirely sealed or the Watcher was fully depressurized and now structurally stabilized by the external Thravex vessel. Ravel waited, clutching the cold metal. He heard nothing, saw nothing. The dead suit was a sarcophagus. Then, a faint, rhythmic thump reached him, vibrating through the metal strut he was holding. It was a sound that shouldn't exist in a zero-pressure, dead environment. It was mechanical, deliberate, and near. The Thravex doesn't use mechanical locomotion, Ravel recalled from Anwen's logs. It glides. The sound repeated. Thump. Drag. Thump. It wasn't external. It was coming from the corridor behind the fractured wall. Something heavy was moving, struggling under an artificially induced local gravity field. Ravel used his good arm, the right one, to slowly unhook the wrench from the strut. The metal groaned, protesting the friction. He let the tool drift a short distance, its momentary sound immediately swallowed by the dead air. He stabilized his position, reaching into the auxiliary port of his suit. Anwen Drake's datapad was still connected. Though his suit was dead, the port held a tiny, non-standard backup battery meant for emergency data retention, enough to power the datapad for approximately 10 seconds of focused activity. He activated the auxiliary port. The datapad's display flashed, blindingly bright in the darkness. The transfer log, the complete unencrypted final message from Anwen, filled the minuscule screen. But beneath the final text, something new appeared. A faint, flashing glyph. Not Thravex, not colonial standard. It was a maintenance access symbol he dimly recognized from ancient, pre-colonial corporate engineering manuals. A symbol for a high-priority structural bypass. Anwen hadn't just left a warning. She had left an escape route, buried deep within her own failure logs, knowing any attempt to send it via standard comms would have been intercepted. She had smuggled the key inside the story of her own defeat. The glyph pointed to Sector 9, the very section that had just violently depressurized and was now structurally compromised. Ravel read the attached note, written in binary shorthand. Phase Delta is not exile. It is reassignment. Check your transport. The Watcher was fully depressurized. His original transport, the small Raumschiff shuttle he had arrived in, was docked to the umbilical port, its hull sealed and intact. If the Watcher was now structurally stabilized by the Thravex integration, the creature would consider the external shuttle as part of the asset, unnecessary, but contained. But Anwen's note mentioned Phase Delta, the exile protocol. Kalis had ordered his removal via shuttle. Protocol demanded that upon arrival, the shuttle be automatically drained of its excess fuel and lubricant, highly inefficient, volatile material, and prepped for immediate return to Verlassung Drei. If Kalis's efficiency protocols were truly absolute, the shuttle's internal systems, now pressurized and isolated from the compromised Watcher, would contain only enough power for the return trip, and only the minimal, protocol-mandated amount of fuel. The Thravex, however, was a data predator focused on the structure of the asset it was absorbing. It had absorbed the Watcher. It would assume the shuttle was merely a dead piece of external hardware. It would not bother to check the shuttle's internal maintenance logs, especially if those logs had been overwritten by Anwin's chaotic data burst, which had overloaded the local Thravex systems moments ago. Ravel stared at the single, massive flaw in the Thravex's logic. Its inability to anticipate the human element of cutting corners and disobeying protocol, the very inefficiency he had been banished for. Kalis, in her haste to expel him, had authorized the minimal return fuel load. She had not bothered to check the pressure integrity of the internal cargo bay on the shuttle, since it was only supposed to be an empty vehicle for a cold, automated return trip. But Ravel knew Kalis's personal vice. She was utterly contemptuous of low-level, non-critical inventory. And the standard phase delta transport protocol included a small, unpressurized cargo container in the shuttle bay meant for the exile's personal effects. And in that cargo container, Ravel knew, would be the most inefficient piece of technology the colony had. His daughter's archaic heavy-duty emergency life raft, a relic from the first settlement, designed for brute force survival and utterly ignored by the hyper-efficient administration. The thump, drag, thump was closer now. Ravel had to get from the breached Sector 9 to the umbilical port, a distance of 50 meters in absolute zero, darkness and vacuum, with a ruined shoulder, no air, and an unknown heavy object approaching. He had one chance: leverage the force of the remaining air being sucked from the core of the station. Ravel reached the jagged edge of the breach, the place where the Thravex had ripped the hull open. The edges were still microscopically warm from the focused sapphire energy. He gripped the remaining strut with his right hand, the suit's thick glove providing minimal friction. He felt the pull of the vortex, the last gasp of air from the Watcher's sealed central modules. The air wasn't escaping through the breach. It was flowing into the breach, stabilizing the pressure differential as the Thravex finished its fusion. Ravel needed to turn the vortex into a slingshot. He pushed off the wall with a final, agonizing grunt, his ruined shoulder instantly seizing up with white-hot pain. He let the vacuum pull his weight, turning his body into a projectile. He was moving fast, aimed blindly down the length of the cold, dark corridor toward the umbilical port. As he shot through the blackness, he heard the thump, drag, thump. Again, directly behind where he had just been. A new sound joined the mechanical dragging, a loud, abrasive scrape, like metal on ceramic. Ravel risked a look back. The emergency light on Anwen's dying datapad, still attached to his suit, illuminated the corridor for a final, catastrophic moment. He saw the thing that was dragging itself. It was a massive, blocky construct, like a heavily armored drone, but moving with the irregular, clumsy gait of a manually piloted machine. It was built for brute force retrieval, a mechanical counter-mandate to the Threvex's organic assimilation, and strapped to its primary chassis, fixed with magnetic clamps, was Chief Kalis, encased in her operational exosuit, her face shielded by a dark, reflective visor. She was not dead. She was here, using a mechanical drone to manually police her failed exile. She had followed him, not for revenge, but for the efficient retrieval of her failed asset. And the drone's massive, magnetic manipulator arm was holding the heavy wrench Ravel had dropped. Kalis was recovering his unauthorized tool. Then, Kalis saw Ravel, a fast-moving shadow with a faint blinking light, streaking toward the shuttle. Kalis's voice, filtered through the Watcher's local comms, now partially operational through the Thravex link, cut through the dead air, devoid of inflection, utterly flat. Exile Ravel Thornick. Stop. Unauthorized movement is an inefficient use of terminal resources. Ravel ignored her, focusing entirely on the umbilical port, flashing faintly in the distance. He was not going to stop. He was going to use Kalis's efficient drone as a momentary distraction. Kalis made her move. She accelerated the drone. The thump, drag, thump, transforming into a violent, churning roar of magnets against the deck plates. Ravel slammed into the shuttle's external hatch, the force of the collision jarring his teeth. His right hand flew to the manual override. He needed to cycle the lock before Kalis's brute force machine could reach him. He slammed his fist against the release panel. The lights of the drone were bearing down on him, the metallic screeching of its movement filling the dead air. The airlock hissed in protest, resisting the forced cycle. It didn't open. The seal was locked. "Ravel Thornick," Kalis repeated, her voice perfectly level. "The drone is equipped with non-lethal stasis projectors. If you force the lock, the shuttle integrity will be compromised, and the remaining fuel for return will be ejected." Ravel felt the searing heat of the drone's approach against his back. He looked down at Anwen's datapad, its power flickering rapidly. He saw the final, desperate instruction she had left. The shuttle had no fuel ejection mechanism. Kalis was lying. She was using a calculated threat, anticipating his efficiency logic. Ravel put his right hand on the emergency release and pulled. The airlock screamed, the mechanical components groaning under the pressure. The shuttle hatch opened a mere 2 inches, but that was enough. Kalis fired. A high-frequency pulse slammed into Ravel's back. He felt the electrical charge burn through the back of his dead suit, convulsing his muscles. He lost his grip. He was thrown backward, drifting into the corridor. The datapad flew from his hand, tumbling away into the blackness, its last light instantly extinguished. Ravel watched, paralyzed, as Kalis's massive drone moved with cold, mechanical authority, bridging the gap between the Watcher and the shuttle. Kalis, a silhouette of unyielding protocol, was securing the breach and ensuring the efficient retrieval of the failed asset. The internal shuttle light came on. The door hissed open, not for Ravel, but for Kalis. Ravel drifted, the paralysis wearing off, his body a heavy, useless sack. He was alone in the dark, 30 feet from his failed escape. He felt the faint, distant vibration of the shuttle's internal power systems coming online, preparing for the automated return trip. He was defeated. Captured by the system he had tried so hard to outwit. But Kalis had failed to account for one thing. Anwen's message was still burned into his mind. Phase Delta is not exile. It is reassignment. Check your transport. If Kalis was so worried about recovering the shuttle, it wasn't just for the fuel. It was for the cargo. Ravel turned his numb body toward the open shuttle door, a small, dark aperture promising a cold, efficient end. He began to paddle weakly through the vacuum, not toward Kalis, but toward the exposed lower deck of the shuttle's open cargo bay, hoping against every logic that Anwen Drake's final gift, his daughter's useless life raft, was still there, untouched by efficiency. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. He had to move. The paralysis from Kalis's pulse was receding, leaving behind a deep, shaking fatigue. Ravel paddled through the vacuum, using his functioning right arm, aiming for the open Raumschiff hatch. The drone and Kalis were now inside the shuttle, likely stabilizing the control systems, initiating the return trajectory, and preparing to secure the failed asset, himself. He was counting on Kalis's fatal flaw, her absolute contempt for the low-value, non-critical inventory. He reached the umbilical port, the thick polymer hull of the shuttle cold beneath his gloved hand. He didn't enter the main cabin where Kalis was. He fought the powerful magnetic inertia of the drone's docking clamps, hauling himself underneath the primary fuselage toward the small, rarely used maintenance access to the cargo bay. The bay was unpressurized, exposed to the void, designed only for storing items that wouldn't be damaged by zero temperature or vacuum. Protocol demanded that personal effects for Phase Delta exiles be shipped and retrieved, and Kalis, despite her efficiency, was meticulous about chain of custody documentation. Ravel found the access panel by touch, a circular hatch secured by 5 manual latches. His fingers, still numb, struggled with the heavy steel, the thick gloves making the fine motor control impossible. He ripped off his right glove with his teeth, the sudden, searing cold of the metallic hull on his exposed skin, a brutal, effective shock. He worked the latches one by one, the sound of the metal pins retracting muffled by the dead air. He heard the faint, high-pitched whine of the shuttle's navigation system initializing inside the main cabin. Kalis was ready to leave. The final latch clicked. Ravel shoved the panel inward and pulled himself through the narrow opening. The cargo bay was dark and filled with the stale odor of institutional plastic. There, secured by simple nylon webbing, was the container. A bulky orange cylinder, thick with ancient heat-resistant composites. It was the emergency life raft from the first landing phase, a ridiculously oversized, heavy piece of equipment that should have been recycled 2 decades ago. Kalis hadn't recycled it because the logistics of disposal, the documentation, the environmental impact assessment, the energy spent, were deemed more inefficient than simply letting the item exist in storage until it decayed naturally. A perfect, bureaucratic failure. Ravel grabbed the webbing, pulling the heavy cylinder free. It was meant to hold 3 adults and sustain them for 40 standard cycles. It was designed to land in a planetary atmosphere, crash through ice, and survive radiation storms. It was the epitome of redundant, unnecessary safety. It was beautiful. Ravel Thornick, Kalis's voice crackled again, now impossibly loud, as she broadcast directly onto the external shuttle frequency, which his dead suit's passive receiver could pick up. I have neutralized the Thravex threat by sealing the breach. The Watcher is contained. Your deviation is resolved. Return to the main cabin for extraction. You sealed the breach? Ravel choked the question out, his voice weak in the vacuum, the words vibrating only within his helmet. Affirmative, Kalis replied, flatly. The Thravex data signature was volatile. I overloaded the local field generator using the shuttle's excess power. The organism retreated to preserve its core data integrity. It views the station as contaminated. It is a temporary solution, but optimal for retrieval. The Thravex hadn't been defeated. It had simply calculated that the cost of assimilation was too high, polluted by Ravel's chaos. Kalis had chased it away by making the situation inefficient. An imperfect victory. Ravel realized he had only a few seconds left. Kalis would be out here soon. Kalis, Ravel said, his voice raw with the effort of communication. You should have recycled the ballast tank on the Romschiff. Silence. Even Kalis's protocol seemed to stumble over the sheer banality of the statement. Ravel ignored her, focusing on the raft. The raft was an obsolete model, relying on chemical reaction for initial inflation, not electrical pumps. And that chemical reaction required a specific catalyst housed in a small external compartment, the ballast tank. He located the tank, about the size of a fist, secured with a single thick bolt. He needed a leverage tool. The wrench was gone, retrieved by Kalis's drone. He reached into his utility belt and pulled out the only thing left. A small, specialized pry bar used for separating fused microcircuitry. A tool designed for finesse, not brute force. Ravel slotted the tip of the pry bar into the bolt head and twisted. The bolt resisted, cemented by years of disuse and temperature shifts. Ravel leaned his entire weight against it, pushing with his functioning right side, the pain in his left shoulder, a screaming white noise. Snap! The bolt sheared cleanly at the neck. The tiny sound was the most satisfying thing Ravel had heard all day. "What are you doing, Ravel?" Kalis's voice was laced with the first hint of genuine emotion he had heard. Pure, cold suspicion. "That component is non-critical." "It's about the manganese, Kalis," Ravel whispered, wrenching the ballast tank free. It was full of the heavy, volatile catalyst. "You valued the manganese for the reactor coils. I valued the chemical volatility for this." He turned the valve on the ballast tank. The high-pressure catalyst inside hissed, escaping into the vacuum. "The shuttle is initiating final launch sequence," Kalis warned. "I am sending the drone." Ravel secured the ancient life raft to the exterior of the shuttle using a quick release loop, ensuring the raft's internal inflation trigger was positioned directly beneath the Raumschiff's central engine housing. He was betting that Kalis's temporary field neutralization had left the Thravex passive, but vigilant. He was betting the creature was still listening, waiting for the structure to return to optimal parameters. Kalis's drone, a massive, blocky shape, emerged from the shuttle's lower ramp, its magnets clanging loudly on the outer hull. Its single manipulator arm, holding Ravel's wrench like a trophy, swung toward him. Ravel didn't fight the drone. He took the tank of volatile catalyst, placed its open end against the shuttle's hull, and pushed the entire cylinder hard against the metal. The friction, combined with the extreme volatility of the released chemical, caused an immediate contained flash. It wasn't an explosion. It was a pressure surge, a sudden, high-intensity thermal spike designed only to disrupt. The shuttle's delicate external sensor array, which had been automatically checking the hull integrity, fried instantly, overloaded by the sudden localized heat and chemical imbalance. The ship's automated systems, designed for absolute efficiency, did what they were programmed to do when faced with a catastrophic sensor failure right before launch. It aborted. Warning: external integrity sensor failure. Engine lockout engaged. Aborting launch. The automated voice of the shuttle system was drowned out by Kalis's enraged shout, the only sound Ravel had ever heard her make that wasn't regulated. "Ravel! That component was essential for navigation." "Exactly, Kalis!" Ravel yelled back, scrambling toward the external antenna housing near the tail fin. "It wasn't essential for survival if you know how to fly blind, but it was essential for protocol." The drone paused, momentarily paralyzed by the conflicting data inputs from the aborted launch sequence. Kalis, encased inside, was fighting the machine for manual control. Ravel reached the antenna housing. He knew from the ship schematics that the housing contained the main comms wire, which was also the hardline conduit for the shuttle's internal auxiliary power. Kalis was using that power to run the drone and maintain life support while waiting for the automated launch. Ravel pulled out his last tool, a small coil of specialized, non-conductive filament, a useless piece of maintenance gear he used for practicing fine soldering. He wrapped the filament tightly around the comms wire, then wedged the pry bar into the housing for leverage. Kalis regained manual control of the drone. It lunged, its massive magnets sparking against the hull. Ravel pulled the pry bar. The filament acted as a choke wire, snapping the comms conduit cleanly. The lights on the drone immediately died. The power that fueled Kalis's mobility and monitoring systems was severed. The drone, now a dead weight of several hundred kilograms of dense metal, slumped against the hull with a grinding thud. The internal shuttle systems went silent, running only on their internal low-power buffer, enough to keep Kalis alive, but not enough to control external assets or run the main engines. Ravel's victory was immediate and devastating, but piratical. He was floating beside a powerless shuttle, an immobilized Kalis, and an angry Thravex entity waiting for the contaminants to dissipate. He wasted no time. He activated the life raft's inflation trigger. The chemical reaction was violent, with a loud whoosh that echoed through the dense material of the hull. The ancient life raft expanded, forcing itself between the disabled drone and the main engine housing of the Raumschiff. The orange material expanded rapidly, pushing the dead drone away. The sheer bulk of the raft, designed with pre-colonial over-engineered materials, pressed against the engine housing. Ravel didn't care about the damage. He pulled the quick-release loop, separating the raft from the shuttle. Kalis's voice, now muffled, barely audible through the thick hull, shouted an incoherent protest. Ravel grabbed the side of the fully inflated raft, pulling himself onto the dense outer skin. He felt the cold, thick material beneath his damaged fingers. He had air, insulation, and redundancy. He looked back at the shuttle. The orange raft, a sphere of inefficient, beautiful waste, was wedged firmly against the engine housing, trapping the dead drone and Kalis inside the powerless Raumschiff. She was safe, contained, and neutralized by her own inability to anticipate the unnecessary. Ravel then looked past the shuttle, toward the vast, empty space where the Watcher station now floated. The Watcher was completely dark, save for a few stray emergency lights. It was locked, contained, and structurally compromised. And hovering silently, 300 meters out, was the Thravex. It had retreated, waiting. But Ravel noticed something new. The Thravex was no longer focused on the Watcher. Its main visual sensor, a faint, pulsing internal light, was now trained directly on the orange raft. The massive, chaotic inefficiency of the ancient survival pod, now isolated in the void, was a data anomaly too great to ignore. Ravel realized his critical error. He hadn't defeated the system. He had just given the Thravex a new, more interesting problem to solve. He was safe for now, contained in the life raft, but he was alone in a large, bright, screaming beacon of non-standard protocol, tethered only by an umbilical line of his own desperation. He reached into the raft's main survival kit, a heavy internal cavity that hadn't been inventoried in decades. He found the old-world equipment, a water recycler, ration bars, and a small, archaic signal beacon designed to emit a low-frequency, brute-force distress call capable of piercing atmospheric density. He activated the beacon. It didn't hum or chirp. It began a slow, rhythmic beep, 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 a sound so inefficient it consumed 3 times the power of a standard colonial comms burst. Ravel looked out into the absolute blackness. He was 30 light seconds from the colony, adrift in a beacon of pure chaos, being observed by a data predator that was the logical evolution of the society that had exiled him. He secured the rations and settled his ruined body onto the rough, uncomfortable floor of the raft. His left shoulder felt like raw fire. He coughed, the phantom smell of the relith bloom, the illegal moss, catching in his memory. He had won a messy, imperfect victory against efficiency. He was free. But freedom tasted like ozone, exhaustion, and the profound, isolating cold of the vast dark. He was a fugitive, in a bright orange lifeboat, holding a signal beacon that advertised his position to everything that lived in the dark. Ravel closed his eyes, leaning back against the redundant, over-engineered hull. He was alive, for now, not because he was smart, but because he was willing to embrace the mess. The Thravex didn't move. It simply observed the orange life raft, gathering data on the new, magnificent failure of logic floating before it. The rhythmic, insistent beep, beep, beep of the signal beacon was the only sound in the universe. Ravel opened his eyes, staring at the ceiling of the raft. He had escaped the system, only to become a much greater, more exposed problem. He wondered briefly what Kalis would have said about his long-term prospects. Statistically, he thought, lethal. Ravel gave a dry, painful laugh, a small, futile sound immediately absorbed by the thick insulation of the raft. He adjusted his position, putting pressure on the one thing that still worked: the archaic, inefficient signal beacon. He just needed someone else, anyone, to hear the sound of unnecessary loud survival. The deep space was quiet, save for the beacon. And then faintly, vibrating through the cold composite hull, Ravel heard something else, a sound so unexpected, so impossibly far, that he almost dismissed it as hypoxia. A distant, faint click. It was the signature of a directional comms scan, a tight beam cutting through the noise. It wasn't the Thravex's broad-spectrum query. It was colonial, but archaic, a high-power, low-bandwidth military protocol. A protocol used for deep space patrols, the kind of ships that the colony leadership pretended didn't exist because they were an astronomical waste of fuel. The signal was faint, but it was there, confirming that his inefficient, ridiculous signal beacon had been heard. Ravel leaned forward, grabbing the thick rations bag. He was no longer running blind. Someone, out there in the dark, had just budgeted for his melancholy. The faint, high-power click resonated not through the air, but directly through the dense, redundant material of the life raft. It bypassed the high-frequency static of the void, cutting straight to the core of Ravel's exhaustion. It was a calculated, energy-intensive response, the kind of comms query that only a vessel far outside the colony's primary budget would employ. The violent rush of adrenaline that had sustained Ravel through the fight was gone, replaced by a deep, shivering cold that seeped into his bones, far beyond what his suit could regulate. His left shoulder was a knot of fire and shattered nerves. He realized he hadn't fully inflated the raft for survival. He had inflated it for spite. He was floating in a pressurized, warm, but incredibly cramped orange sphere, an eyesore against the dark, 30 light seconds from the people who wished him gone. The steady, heavy beep-beep-beep of the archaic beacon hammered the air inside the raft. It wasn't the sound of hope. It was the sound of a technical malfunction broadcasting its precise location. Ravel used his good arm to pull a thick, damp cloth from the survival kit. He dabbed the raw, cold skin of his exposed right hand, which he had used to shear the bolt. He secured the damaged arm inside his tunic for warmth, conserving his failing internal battery. He looked out the thick, small porthole toward the stranded shuttle. Kalis was still inside, immobilized, trapped by the bureaucratic weight of a failure she had never anticipated, a truly useless piece of cargo being deployed at the most critical moment. He thought of her for a moment, not with triumph, but with a weary pity. Kalis was safe. She would be retrieved, likely reprimanded for the operational deviation, but her life was never in danger. She was contained, a clean closure enforced by a layer of 2 decades-old, obsolete polymer. She had won her own kind of inefficient, contained safety. The Thravex was still there, observing, not menacingly, but with the curiosity of a scientist presented with an impossible data set. The orange raft, chaotic, chemically reactive, and now loudly broadcasting its distress, was a paradox. It was the perfect anti-algorithm. Ravel understood then that the creature would not attack unless it could rationalize the event. He had made himself utterly irrational, too complicated for clean consumption. He reached for the ration packs. He peeled back the thick synthetic foil. The smell of the nutrient paste, metallic, sterile, necessary, triggered a sudden sharp memory of the compression he felt upon his exile, that rough, immediate thrust, rattling his molars against the mouthpiece. The scent of ozone and superheated coolant, the cocktail of systems failure. Now, hours later, the systems failure was achieved, spectacular and total, but the taste in his mouth was different. It wasn't ozone and forced pressure. It was blood and exhaustion. Ravel didn't know who was answering his call. They were using a military frequency, likely registered to some fringe patrol operating on a margin so tight, Kalis would have deemed their existence fiscally negligent. They were the colony's dirty secret, the human inefficiency required to protect the clean, automated world. He wasn't heading toward a safe harbor. He was heading toward an interrogation room, or maybe a derelict mining facility, where his skill set could still be squeezed for profit before he was permanently decommissioned. He was a piece of volatile salvage now, worth more alive for the questions he could answer than dead for the trouble he caused. He smiled faintly, a painful movement that pulled at the dried sweat on his face. The Relith bloom. He had traded his comfortable exile for the raw, cold freedom of absolute uselessness, and then used that uselessness to survive. The bioluminescent moss, the thing he had been exiled for protecting, was gone, recycled back into the colony's primary filtration system. But the principle was intact. He had valued the things that couldn't be measured. Ravel adjusted his position, feeling the rough fibers of the ancient composite hull beneath him. He was a fugitive, waiting for capture by an obsolete military patrol, being watched by an alien entity, while his nemesis floated a few hundred meters away in an expensive disabled shuttle. He was alive, yes, but he had failed to find peace, failed to secure freedom, and failed to neutralize the threat entirely. His victory was simply the right to choose his next, more complicated problem. This was the consequence of choosing chaos over optimization. It was heavy, painful, and profoundly real. He looked through the porthole one last time, past the shimmering, data-hungry presence of the Thravex. He saw the distant clinical lights of Verlasung, his former home, now appearing impossibly small and insignificant. The faint, military click came again, closer this time, followed by a data handshake query, slow and deliberate. They were locking onto the beacon. Ravel closed his eyes, accepting the long wait. He wasn't afraid of the capture or the eventual punishment. He was just immensely, perfectly tired. The fight was over. Now came the long, grinding extraction. He traded sterile efficiency for this brutal, undeniable ache. Survival isn't efficient. It's just noise, and the relentless, stupid ache. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions, and share this episode with someone who still believes in science.